You never expect to see a ghost on an airplane. At least I didn't, not after 10 years of carrying on, learning how to live without him. But there he was in seat 2A, looking very much alive. I had been making my rounds, the same way I always did before a flight took off, greeting passengers and ensuring everything was in order. The cabin hummed with the familiar energy of an early morning flight, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the oval windows and casting a soft, golden light across the plush leather seats. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and espresso, a luxurious blend that hinted at the amenities offered only to those who could afford first class on a transatlantic journey. The subtle click of luggage being stowed overhead and the rustle of newspapers were as routine as the reassuring thrum of the engines below. It was a London-bound flight, the kind of route that attracted a mix of business executives, celebrities seeking anonymity behind sunglasses and scarves, and wealthy vacationers with designer luggage. I liked this particular flight because it felt like a world apart, suspended in a bubble of comfort and refinement. The crisp uniforms of the crew, the gleaming metal accents on the overhead compartments, and the quiet conversations conducted in low, cultured tones all contributed to a sense of order that I found oddly calming. I liked the routine, the sense of predictability. There was something about the way the morning light glinted off the champagne glasses, already placed on the armrest in preparation for takeoff, that made everything feel composed and purposeful. Each pre-flight checklist was a ritual, a way of creating structure in the boundless sky. After a decade in the skies, I thought there wasn't much that could shake me. The atmosphere, with its subdued elegance, had become as familiar as the beat of my own heart. But then I saw him. I swear, for a moment, the air left my lungs, and it felt as though the entire cabin had shrunk, pressing in from all sides. My heart stuttered like an engine about to stall, and a cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck. The drink tray I was carrying tilted precariously, the glasses rattling as my grip weakened. It took every ounce of effort not to drop it right there in the aisle. The man in the first-class seat turned his head, his movements slow and deliberate, and then our eyes met. My breath hitched in my throat. It was him, or someone who looked so much like him that it seemed the universe had played some cruel trick on me. His hair was the same deep shade of brown I remembered, though slightly longer now, the strands falling just above his ears with the faintest touch of gray at the temples. It wasn't the kind of gray that made him look older, but rather the kind that spoke of years passing, of days worn down by time. His eyes, those deep-set eyes, had the same familiar intensity, as if they held entire conversations in silence. There was a shadow behind them, a depth that only comes from seeing too much or knowing too little. And then there was the scar. God, that scar. It sliced through his left eyebrow in a jagged line, faintly pale against the skin, a permanent reminder of that long-ago summer at the coast. I could still remember the scene with startling clarity. The sun setting behind us, casting golden light over the water. Daniel leaning over the side of the boat, laughing as he struggled to reel in his catch. There was a sudden snap, a shout, and then blood trickling down his face as he grinned at me, telling me it was just a scratch. I hadn't thought of that day in years, had buried it with all the other memories that hurt too much to hold on to. But now, seeing that scar again, it was as if the past had clawed its way back to the surface, refusing to be forgotten. I don't know how long I stood there, staring like I'd seen a ghost, or something worse. The past wasn't supposed to come back, not like this. It was buried, closed off, resigned to a corner of my memory. I didn't visit often because there was nothing left to revisit. Or so I thought. When I finally managed to move, it felt like pushing through thick fog, every step heavy and uncertain. I slipped back into my role, forcing myself to straighten my spine and plaster on the practice smile I had worn for so many years. My voice emerged as a thin thread, stretched tight and fragile, holding together the facade of composure I had built over a decade. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" The words left my mouth like shards of glass, each one jagged and trembling at the edges. I could hear the unsteadiness in my own tone, a faint quiver that betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. I wondered if he could hear it, too, if the slight crack in my voice echoed the fracture that had split my world open in that moment. He looked up at me, his expression calm and detached, as though I were just another attendant interrupting his thoughts. His smile was polite, a quick curve of the lips. It was the kind of smile you give a stranger you have no intention of knowing, and yet there was something in the way he spoke, something achingly familiar. "No, thank you," he said, his voice resonating with a deep timbre that made my chest tighten. The sound of it stirred memories I had buried long ago. It was like hearing a favorite song from another lifetime, one that played when you still believed in forever. "I'm fine," he added, the words falling softly into the space between us. Fine. Was that what he was? Fine. I had spent a decade haunted by the echo of a life we were supposed to live together, and here he was, fine. I retreated, my legs moving of their own accord, as if they couldn't carry me away fast enough. The galley felt smaller than ever, claustrophobic even, and I clutched the edge of the counter, as if it could ground me in reality. But reality was shifting, tilting like the plane we were about to lift off in, and nothing felt real. Not anymore. I closed my eyes and willed myself to breathe, in and out, drawing the air deep into my lungs, holding it there until the ache subsided. Just like I had been taught when I was learning to cope, when everything seemed to collapse inwards, leaving me clawing for any semblance of control. Because 10 years ago, the coping was all I had. When they told me Daniel was gone, lost at sea, they said the words had felt like cold metal slicing through skin, as though someone had reached inside me and ripped out a vital part, leaving a hollow where my heart used to be. The ocean had swallowed him, they explained, with all the dispassion of people who had never known what it was to lose everything in one breath. There was no body to bury, no solid proof of death to clutch onto in my darkest hours. Just a handful of condolences and the quiet, desperate hope that the sea would give him back to me, that it hadn't taken him for good. I had spent months in that limbo, standing on the rocky shore at dawn, the wind tugging in my hair and salt stinging my skin as I stared out at the horizon until my eyes burned. I would fix my gaze on the endless blue, daring it to give me some sign, a flash of white sails, the dark shape of a boat breaking through the mist. I pictured him standing there on the deck, waving to me, his face lit with that familiar smile. But the waves only whispered their secrets to the sand, and the ocean remained silent. Each day, I carried that silence back with me to our house, where the air seemed frozen, untouched since the last time he had walked through the door. I would hear his voice in the echoes of the hallways, see his shape in the corner of my vision, slipping away like smoke before I could grasp it. As the seasons bled into one another, that hope I clung to began to wane, flickering like a candle struggling against a draft. It was as if the light had grown too weak to keep the shadows at bay, and with every passing day, the darkness closed in a little more, seeping into the corners of my mind. Eventually, I had to accept it. The night was all that was left. I learned to move through it, to let the darkness wrap around me like an old, worn coat, heavy and cold. I had no choice. Grief became my companion, an uninvited guest that settled into every crevice of my life, until it was easier to live with the emptiness than to fight it. But now he was here, or at least someone who looked and sounded just like him. I had seen many faces pass through the cabin over the years, countless lives briefly intersecting with mine, and I'd never once thought any of them could be him. I didn't allow myself to believe it, yet there was no mistaking him. I would have known that face anywhere. The intercom crackled, announcing final preparations for takeoff, and I pulled myself together just enough to make my way back to my seat. As the plane roared down the runway, lifting into the sky, I felt suspended between worlds, the past and the present blurring at the edges. Every rattle and shift of the cabin felt like a reminder of how everything had once fallen apart. I kept glancing toward him during the flight, watching for some sign, some flicker of recognition in his eyes. But he didn't look back at me. He sat there, flipping through a magazine or staring out the window like any other passenger. I told myself it was absurd, that it had to be a coincidence. But then I would remember the scar, and the certainty would wash over me again like a wave crashing against the rocks. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore. The questions gnawed at me like a persistent ache, each unanswered thought building into a tidal wave of uncertainty. My breath felt shallow, and my pulse hammered against my ribs as I smoothed down my uniform, forcing my hands to stop trembling. I walked toward him slowly, every step echoing with a strange mixture of dread and hope. The overhead lights cast a muted glow over the cabin, illuminating the polished wood of the armrests and the subtle sheen of his leather seat. His profile was turned slightly, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window, perhaps the deepening blue of the evening sky or the sea of twinkling lights far below, as if he were lost in a world only he could see. I stopped just short of him, the faint scent of his cologne, something warm and familiar with hints of cedar and musk, reaching me and stirring memories I had tried to bury. "Sir, is there anything else you need?" I asked, the words leaving my lips with an unsteady softness. They were a thin veil over the questions that knotted in my throat, questions I was too afraid to give voice to. The familiar ache of grief and longing pressed against my chest, making each breath feel like a labor. He glanced up at me, his eyes meeting mine with a politeness that was almost painful. For a moment, they seemed to search my face, as though he was looking for a spark of recognition, a shared history. But if he found anything, he gave no sign. His expression remained distant, his features composed and unreadable, like a mask carefully kept in place. A hint of curiosity flickered in his gaze, but it passed too quickly, leaving nothing behind but a cool detachment. "I'm all set," he said, his voice even and calm. There was a slight pause before he added, "Thank you, miss," the word slipping out like the closing of a door. I felt the impact of that word, "miss," as though it had pushed me back a step. It was polite, proper, and impersonal, as if I were just another attendant passing through his life, as though I hadn't once been the most important person in his world. I nodded stiffly, retreating from his seat as the knot in my stomach tightened, and a cold, hollow sensation settled in my chest. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of half-formed thoughts and questions that I couldn't quite articulate. Could he really have survived all this time? If so, why had he let me believe he was dead? Why had he left me to grieve alone? As we began our descent, the cabin seemed to grow tighter, the walls closing in around me as the engine's hum became a dull roar in my ears. The muted gray sky outside the window darkened, casting long shadows across the aisle, and the soft glow of the overhead lights flickered to life, bathing everything in a sterile, artificial light. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing louder than the droning engines. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront him, no matter how ridiculous or desperate it seemed. My mind spun with every possible scenario, but only one thing mattered now. I had to hear him say it, one way or another. The plane jolted as the wheels made contact with the tarmac, the sudden weight of gravity pulling us back to Earth. The cabin lights brightened, illuminating the faces of passengers as they stirred from their travel-induced stupors, reaching for bags and jackets in the overhead compartments. The air felt thicker, charged with the finality of the moment. I stood up, my knees trembling, and moved down the aisle, my pulse quickening with every step toward him. He was still seated, his posture relaxed, as if this were just another flight for him. But for me, this was everything. I could feel the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions pressing down on me. The words caught in my throat like jagged stones. As passengers began gathering their things around me, I forced myself to move closer, each step heavy with dread. I opened my mouth, my voice barely a whisper. "Excuse me, sir," I began, though my words felt distant, like someone else was speaking them. I have to ask, do I know you?" He looked up, his gaze locking with mine, and in that instant, the noise of the cabin, the rustling of coats, the clinking of luggage wheels, faded into a dull hum. It was just the two of us. His eyes, a shade too familiar, held mine for a beat longer than they should have, a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, glimmering beneath the surface. Or was it pity? I couldn't tell, and that terrified me. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, and I felt exposed, laid bare in front of him like an open wound. "I don't think so," he replied softly, his voice smooth, controlled. "I'm sorry." And with that, he stood. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second glance as he grabbed his bag and turned toward the aisle. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air as he walked away, disappearing into the stream of passengers heading toward the terminal. I wanted to shout, to run after him, to demand the truth, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot, frozen in place. The cabin around me emptied, but I remained stuck in the vortex of my own mind. My thoughts raced, spiraling into 1,000 possibilities. What if it was him? What if it wasn't? What if he had been alive all this time, living some other life, while I had been left behind to mourn a ghost? I stood there, lost in the chaos of it all, as the last of the passengers filtered out, alone, just like I had been for the past 10 years. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't him. Or maybe, just maybe, the man I had known was truly gone, and all that remained was a stranger with a familiar face. But as I returned to the empty cabin to begin cleaning up, I found a note tucked into my station. The words were simple, scrawled in handwriting I recognized all too well. Forgive me, Nora. There are things you were never meant to know.